Hello, darling, I come in. Of course, you know no one can against me. Of course, we're in 100 in the kitchen. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have, that we have our money safe. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have, that no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that I'm here, that no one can against me, that I'm gonna give you a kiss, and that we are gonna live. Of course, darling, that is what you can have in Aphrodite in the Panama Papers. Of course, darling, and running or Harley. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That the jokes on me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, and that we are gonna be so fine. Of course, darling, you're pure gold. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me, that we're so fine, that no one can against us, that we're gonna be so right. Of course, darling, I'm gonna give you a kiss, and we're gonna live with all the money. Of course, darling, that is what you can have here, that no one can against me. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're so fine, that we're gonna live with everything. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna ride with the cars and no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna set everything on fire. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, that we're gonna set everything on fire, no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna ride and no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we are so fine, that we are so well, that we can have what we want and we're gonna go. Of course, that is what you can have, that we will survive, you know that. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're in Aphrodite in the Panama Papers, and with the Harley running. Of course, darling, no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, we're gonna have so much fun. I can give you that. Of course, darling, you know. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have here, that no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they are the whole time running after us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna give them a headshot and we're gonna forget about them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna give them a headshot and we're gonna forget about them. Of course, darling, you know I'm interested in being clean. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, I'm interested, so let's give them a headshot and forget about them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against us. So come on, we're gonna forget about them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we have pure gold. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we count our money. Of course, darling, no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, you're gonna ride. Of course, darling, you know that. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that they are so crazy. Everyone running after just one woman. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I go to one, then I go to the next one, and I forget about all them. Of course, darling, and I give a damn. Of course, darling, I'm not gonna run after one woman and many people and armies of people running just after one woman. Of course, darling, I'm gonna forget about them, and I'm gonna give at them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me today. Taste a little bit here, then I go there and taste another little bit, and I forget about all them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I don't wanna marry you. You know that is a touch and go and see you later. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. So I work and so I'm gonna keep. Of course, darling, that is what you can have from me. So come on, of course. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you're gonna give to my headshot and you're gonna forget about them. I can show you that. Of course, darling, we're here in Aphrodite and in the Harley with the Panama papers. Of course, darling, so forget about all them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you're gonna shoot them in the head. Of course, and we're gonna shoot them off. Of course, darling. And you're gonna give it them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that we are gonna fall in a sauna in hell. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, and you're gonna give it them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, fear that and that they cannot bury me, and you know that. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they are so done. Of course, darling, they are burning me in the beach and in Notre Dame, and regretting it in the confessionary. And you know that, of course, darling, with the 219, with the capital letters, you have to let them. Of course, darling, my trust also, darling, so come on. Of course, everyone regretting it in the confessionary, so come on. Of course, darling, let's have our empire fun and strippers and everything we want. Of course, darling, so forget about them. No one can against us. Of course, darling. Let's go with Aphrodite with the Panama papers running a Harley and forget about all that. Of course, darling. A kiss and bye. Love you so much.